Today I'm working on a little cheap and easy meal prep for busy days ahead. I'm stocking up my freezer with easy meals to redirect my attention out of the kitchen and into the garden. Join along for a few ideas and tips as I make sourdough discard crepes, meatballs with garden herbs, beef and broccoli, sesame chicken, and lemon dill chicken. I have been recipe testing these sourdough crepes and I finally perfected them, and they are on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. But these are sourdough discard crepes, and if you don't do sourdough, you don't have to worry about the sourdough part. You can find any crepe recipe and then turn them into a freezer meal. But what I like about these is that they use up a lot of ingredients and they're really cheap to make, and you're using that excess sourdough discard if you have any, so you're not wasting that food, because sourdough discard is in fact food. The trickiest part about making these sourdough crepes is figuring out the consistency of the batter, because it needs to be thin. If it's not thin, it's basically just a pancake, and it's a little hard to tell you exactly how much liquid to put into your ingredients because it really depends on the hydration of your starter, how big your eggs are, the humidity, and the environment that you're living in. So what I do is I put in about a half a cup of milk, and then I start adding in a little more milk at a time until it is about the consistency of heavy cream. I'm actually doubling up this recipe, so I'm making a big batch that I'm going to freeze, so that way we can have crepes in the mornings on busy days. We have a pretty busy morning schedule. My 3-year-old goes to Montessori school, and so we get up and we are out the door really quickly. So I have mine with yogurt and fruit before she even gets up and gets downstairs, and then she actually eats her sourdough crepes often in the car on the way to school, because that's just the way things work out these days. So it works out really well to have a big batch of these on hand, so we can kind of tailor how we eat them for our own taste, but then we can also use them on the go. Here, I've mixed all of the ingredients together, and now I'm just trying to get the consistency right. Mine was a little bit thicker than heavy cream because that's how we like ours. I like my crepe somewhere between an actual crepe and a pancake, but you can make it however you prefer. And making crepes is the rare occasion that I don't use my cast iron pan and actually use a nonstick skillet. And that's because the cast iron, it's a little heavy for me to pick up and turn. So what I do is I put about a teaspoon of butter in the nonstick skillet, and then I'd say probably somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 cup of batter, depending on the size of your pan. I found that about a 9-inch skillet is a pretty good size for a crepe, and this is a 9-inch skillet. So if that gives you a reference point, that's helpful. That's what I'm using. And then you pick it up and just move the pan around in a circular motion to spread the batter. I cannot do that with my cast iron pan. I guess I'm a weakling. I don't know, but I just can't do it. So I have to use a lighter pan. Making a crepe is a lot like making a pancake, where the first one is always the worst one. I don't know why. The first crepe and the first pancake just don't turn out. I think it's really just having to get the heat right and trying to get the right amount of batter in there and such. So the first one's always kind of a mess, but you can see they're starting to turn out pretty nicely. I think sometimes when we're trying to think of cheap things to make, we're often thinking of things that maybe don't taste that good or they're like store-bought and that sort of stuff. But sourdough crepes actually are really delicious, and they make you feel kind of fancy, and they're super cheap to make because it's just flour, salt, sugar, butter, eggs, vanilla, and of course sourdough discard mixed together. And that's a pretty cheap thing to have. And then you can use it as a vessel for other things that you have. So it kind of kills two birds with one stone in a lot of ways. To freeze these, I just put them on a wire rack to cool to room temperature, and then I separated them with parchment paper just so they don't stick together in the freezer, and then put them in a freezer bag. And then whenever I want to use them, I just pull one out and pop it in the microwave for about 30 to 45 seconds. So a single batch of these takes, I'd say, about 15 to 20 minutes to make, and then it takes 30 to 40 seconds to have later on for breakfast. So it is cheap and incredibly easy. If you are new to Moon and Magnolia's YouTube channel, welcome. And if not, oh hey, it's good to see you again. But you may or may not know that I stay at home with my daughter and of course run Moon and Magnolia, the blog and YouTube channel. But I also run our what I like to call suburban-ish homestead. So that means I do a lot of scratch cooking, gardening, food preservation. And my husband does have a corporate job, but most of the time he works from home. And so one of the things that's a little tricky for us, and I feel like I'd say this about breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but lunch is also tricky for us because my husband often needs something really quick because he is working even though he is at home. Aaron, my husband, is a meat and potatoes kind of guy, so I am making a big batch of meatballs. And for this, you may have noticed I had onions that I was soaking in water, and that is because I'm using freeze-dried onions. So in my garden this year, I am trying to grow a bunch of onions so I can freeze-dry them for later, but I'm just getting the hang of freeze-drying onions now. So I have the freeze-dried onions soaking in water while I get the rest of the ingredients ready. I'm combining ground beef, sourdough breadcrumbs. I actually have a blog with that recipe, and I have a YouTube video with sourdough breadcrumbs on how to make them. I'll link those in the description box below. And then I'm combining that with a couple of eggs and then some frozen oregano from last year's garden. So if you are interested in starting food preservation, an herb garden is the way to go to get started because all you do is grow the herbs, harvest them, put them in the freezer, and then you can have them for up to a year. It's super easy. So these are really delicious with that fresh oregano in there from last year's garden. I also just remembered at the very last minute, I threw in a little bit of Parmesan cheese because I had some in the fridge that needed to get used up. And that's a really good trick or hack to freezer meals is to use the ingredients that you have. So shop your fridge, shop your pantry, and see what you have that can make a meal from there rather than buying new stuff. Because the point is to keep things cheap and accessible. So rather than buying things, it's a good idea to just collect what we have and see what we can make. I recently started listening to a really great podcast called Frugal Friends. I actually found it by way of Simple Farmhouse Life podcast. But Frugal Friends has a whole episode dedicated to a minimalist pantry, and they share a lot of tips about how to save money grocery shopping and using what you have in your pantry. And one of the tips they shared is to stock your pantry from the back. So put all your new things in the back and move all your old stuff forward. And I think one of the things I'm going to start doing is pulling from the front of my pantry to make freezer meals, because often that's the stuff that I kind of like don't want to use and that gets shoved around and moved around. And often for me, that's just stuff that I just bought on a whim. It was like on sale, or I wanted to try something new, or it's like a half a bag of pasta or something like that. So that's a really good way to use up stuff that you have, put them in a freezer meal, because otherwise you might not even cook it and it would go to waste. And wasted food is wasted money. Okay, so the meatballs I let cool to room temperature, and then I'll come back to those in a little bit and show you how I pack them up. But the next thing that I want to share with you is how to make a few bagged and prepared freezer meals that don't require any pre-cooking. So one of the things that I really like to do when I make freezer meals or any bulk meal prep is one, find cheap ingredients. And so I have carrots and onions and broccoli, and then use those in a bunch of meals. So I only have to chop up that stuff one time. So I chopped up a bunch of broccoli, a bunch of carrots, and a bunch of onions, and then I put them in separate bowls. So I have like a little buffet of ingredients that I can throw in different freezer meals. So just a couple of things to make freezer meal prep a little easier. Get your trash can next to you so that way you can throw away anything really easily and not have to walk across the kitchen. And then get a composting bowl on the countertop too. So that way you can just put all your scraps in there for the composter. Now I am making beef and broccoli. So here I have some sirloin steak that I got on sale. You can use whatever type of beef works for you. I just recommend like a sirloin or some sort of cut like that. And then slice it thinly. And I am putting it in a freezer bag. So I do use a lot of freezer bags for these. If you have any recommendations for how to be a little less wasteful, because these will eventually have to be thrown away, just let me know. I don't have a lot of great solutions for that yet, so I am looking for some recommendations. But then I'm also putting in a mix of broccoli, onions, and carrots in a separate freezer bag, and now I am making a beef and broccoli sauce. You can get this full beef and broccoli recipe on my blog over at moonandmagnolia.com. I'll leave that in the description box below. The other thing that I'm doing here is the ingredients ingredients for this sauce are a lot of the same ingredients for the other freezer meals that I'm going to make. So that way I only have to pull these ingredients out one time. So I am using them in different ratios and proportions, and they're not all exactly the same, but it does minimize how much stuff I have to get out. For this particular freezer meal, I am putting this sauce in a separate bag and I am double bagging it. That's a useful tip because it could leak, and that is exactly what I'm not going for here. So I'm putting the meat in one bag, the vegetables in one bag, and the sauce in another because I'm going to stir fry the veggies and the meat, and then I'm actually going to thicken the sauce later and pour it over. But you'll see in a minute when I make the chicken stir fry, I do it a little bit differently where I pour the sauce right into the bag. So you could do whichever one you prefer, whatever's easiest for you. Then I'm just tossing these into a final freezer bag and then putting them right into the freezer. So I have a couple other meals that I want to show you, but the one thing I really want to note here is that this is super simple. And in fact, I kind of like this type of freezer meal better than the pre-cooked kind because it just turns out better. So once you're ready to use this, you just thaw it, either put it in the fridge overnight or put it in a bowl of water for a few hours, and then you cook it like you would any other meal. And it's super simple because everything is already pre-chopped. It's ready to go. The sauces are made, you just have to cook it. So now I'm making a chicken stir fry, and this is really similar, but I also found a bag of, I think those are sugar snap peas. I can't remember what they are, but a bag of something like that in the fridge. So I threw that in there, and now I'm going back into my little buffet of ingredients and throwing some broccoli, carrots, and onions in there. But this time I'm taking some chicken breast that I found on sale, and I am putting it right into the bag with the veggies and putting the sauce, or in this case, it's really more like a marinade, right into the bag. So it's similar ingredients, but it's done just a little bit differently. So whereas the beef and broccoli I would thaw and then stir fry on the stove, this one I actually make as a sheet pan meal because it just works out better that way with the sauce or the marinade right in the bag like that. I guess to be technical, it'd be more of like a baking dish meal because it is a little saucy, so I don't think it'd work on a sheet pan exactly, but I think you get the point. But the thing is, because these are similar, what I like to do when I do this bulk meal prep is bookend my week. So I do the beef and broccoli maybe on a Monday and do the chicken stir fry later in the week, because that way in the middle of the week, I can mix things up a little bit because sometimes it just gets a little boring to have the same flavor profiles day after day. I think I mentioned that I got these chicken breasts on sale, but I actually have not been using chicken breasts that much because it is so expensive right now. So another tip, which of course I think we all know, is to look for good deals. And when you find a good deal, say on chicken breast, buy as much as you can and then bulk meal prep with it. So that way you have meals ready and you got them for a good deal. I would be lying to you if I told you I was a frugality expert. I am not. In fact, it is not really my skill set. I'm not always great at saving money, but it is something that I'm working on. And I think it's something that most of us are probably always thinking about, and most of us probably even know what to do. We just need these helpful reminders. So I am recording this to remind me and hopefully to remind you that there are ways that we can make scratch-made food for our families that don't have to break the bank, and that doesn't have to conflict with the ways that we want to live our lives either. For example, I love cooking with fresh herbs, but they are so expensive at the store. So maintaining an herb garden during growing season is really important for me because it's a way I can have the ingredients that I want, but without having to pay for it. And it's also a hobby for me. So it fulfills a lot of different things in my life. And I am using fresh dill from my garden for this lemon herb chicken. So I have the rest of the chicken breasts that I got on sale. I threw them in the bag with some olive oil, some fresh squeezed lemon, and then I'm throwing in some chopped dill and some chopped garlic, and I'm throwing that right into the freezer. This is super easy to do. So once you have all your meat prepped and your veggies prepped, for example, things start to go really fast. So I bulk prepped the two beef and broccolis and then the chicken stir fry in this probably in less than 10 minutes after I had all the ingredients prepped. Now the meatballs are pre-cooked, so what's really important about that is that they came all the way down to room temperature. If you pre-cook any freezer meals and you put them in the freezer while they're still hot, it will change the consistency and the texture and it will be less than desirable. So now that they're cool, I'm just putting them into a freezer bag, labeling it, and putting it right into the freezer. Now, one of the things I will do for all of these meals, I'm going to make a big pot of rice, and then we will eat rice with all of these throughout the week. So I have all of our meals ready to go. I'll have the starch or the grain that goes with it ready to go, and all that's left is to thaw and cook the few meals that were not pre-cooked. I hope this has inspired you to think of ways to simplify your meal prep and your grocery budget. Thank you so much for stopping by today.